during 1930s in order to gain power over their neighboring countries and also to oust American and European influence from the region. The Japanese Imperial began its expansion in some places like Manchuria, Inner Mongolia, Jehol, China, and other territories and islands during World War I. When the Empire of Japan invaded French Indochina, Japan entered World War II on September 22, 1940 and had a defense alliance of Germany and Italy under the Tripartite Pact Agreement on September 27, 1940, whose purpose is to put off the United States from entering the conflict not until the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Meanwhile, the American settlement in the Philippines began during the Spanish colonial period. It started during the handover of the Philippines to the United States by Spain in 1898. Since then, United States troops, naval and air station have been there. The Japanese occupation of the Philippines started on December 8, 1941, 10 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. During this time, through coordinated Japanese attacks on the U.S., the Empire of Japan captured the Philippines, Guam and Wake Island, the Dutch Empire in the Dutch East Indies, Thailand and the British Empire in Brunei, Malaya and Hong Kong. Their strategic goal was to cripple the United States Pacific Fleet, capture oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, to expand the outer reaches of the Japanese Empire, to create an alarming defensive perimeter around newly acquired territory, and lastly, to maintain their sphere of influence in China, East Asia, and also Korea. Japan's invasion of the Philippines was part of its bigger plan to conquer Southeast Asia and enlarge its empire, which they called Greatest East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. For the Japanese, the Philippines was strategically important for several reasons: to prevent the U.S. to use the Philippines as advanced base in the region, to acquire staging areas and supply bases to enhance operation against the Dutch East Indies and Guam, to secure the lines of communication between occupied areas in the south and the Japanese home islands, and to limit the Allied intervention when they attempt to launch an offensive campaign in the Australia and the Solomon Islands via dispatching all the forces stationed in the country and other neighboring nations. 5 years before the attack, in 1936, Captain Ichikawa Shingo, a handliner in the Japanese Navy, had toured the Philippines and other parts of Southeast Asia, and learned that these countries had the raw materials Japan needed for its armed forces. Japan was trying to build an empire as an island nation, but they didn't have enough natural resources they needed to be the first world power. On November 6, 1941, Japan created the Southern Expeditionary Army commanded by General Hisashi Terauchi, who had previously been Minister of War, in order to prepare for war in the event that negotiation with the United States did not succeed in meeting Japanese objectives. Assigned by Terauchi, the 14th Army under the command of Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma, the Philippines was attacked. The 14th Army began its invasion at Bataan Island, 120 miles off the north coast of Luzon on December 8, 1941. 2 days later, landing on Camiguin Island, Vigan, Aparia and Gonzaga in northern Luzon followed. Early morning on December 22, 1941, the main attack began at the east coast of Lingayen Gulf. After the airstrike and artillery attack, the Japanese troops landed both north and south of Manila, Philippines. Manila is the capital city of the Philippines. Under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, both local and American troops fought the Japanese invaders. General Douglas MacArthur was designated commander of the United States Armed Forces in the Asia-Pacific region. Like at Pearl Harbor, the American was severely damaged during the attack. Meanwhile, following the airstrikes, the naval forces were ordered to leave. Because of the circumstances in the Philippine Pacific region, reinforcement and resupplies were impossible. With these reasons and pressure led by General MacArthur, the defending troops began following their contingency plan to withdraw into the Bataan Peninsula and to the island of Corregidor at the entrance to Manila Bay. On January 2, 1942, Manila, occupied by the Japanese, and to prevent its destruction, was declared an open city. Because of the worsening Allied position in the Asia-Pacific region, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to relocate to Australia. as Supreme Allied Commander Southwest Pacific Area. MacArthur's famous speech regarding the Philippines, in which he said, "I came out of Bataan and I shall return," was made at Tarawa, South Australia on March 20, 1942. The Philippine defense continued until the final surrender of the U.S.-Philippine forces on the Bataan Peninsula on April 10, 1942, and on Corregidor on May 6, 1942. Around 80,000 prisoners of war captured by the Japanese at Bataan were forced to undertake the infamous Bataan Death March to O'Donnell Prison Camp 105 km to the north. This march lasted from 5 to 10 days depending on when the prisoners joined. Weakened by disease, malnutrition, and treated harshly by their captors, thousands of men died before reaching their destination. The Allied prisoners of war suffered inhuman condition and severe maltreatment from the Japanese captors, that more men died from it in the first 4 months in the camp than had died in the 4 months of battle previously. Years passed since the Japanese Imperial General Staff decided to make the Philippines their final line of defense to stop the American advance toward Japan. They sent every available soldier, airplane, and naval vessel to the defense of the Philippines. Therefore, the Kamikaze Corps was created just to depend on the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. After 3 bitter years, ready and well supplied with information, General MacArthur with his army returned to the Philippines to liberate the country from the Imperial Japanese Army led by General Tomoyuki Yamashita. On October 20, 1944, MacArthur's Allied forces landed on the island of Leyte. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended in disaster for the Japanese and was the biggest naval battle of World War II. To liberate the Philippines was the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. General Yamashita's plan to trap MacArthur's army was prevented by the intelligence information gathered by the guerrillas. Guerrillas means they are the Filipino freedom fighters. The landing in Leyte was followed on the island of Mindoro and around Lingayen Gulf on the west side of Luzon, and the plan towards Manila was initiated. The American and Filipino army overcame the Japanese defenses in Manila, and the Japanese troops put up a last-ditch resistance. The fighting was fierce, especially in the mountains of northern Luzon where the Japanese troops had retreated. The Philippine troops and the recognized freedom fighter units rose up everywhere for the final offensive. Filipino freedom fighters also played a large role during the liberation. The cooperative Filipino population relieved the problem of supply, construction, and civil administration and eased the task of Allied forces in recapturing the country. The war continued until Japan's formal surrender on September 2, 1945. General Tomoyuki Yamashita surrenders to the Filipino soldiers and freedom fighters in the presence of General Jonathan Wainwright and Arthur Percival. The Commonwealth of the Philippines was restored. The Battle of the Philippines was one of Americans' greatest military defeats. It was also one of the most successful acts of resistance to Japanese expansion in the early war. But for the Filipinos, between the year of 1941 to 1945, the Japanese period happened to be the darkest events in Philippine history. The Philippines had suffered great loss of lives and tremendous physical destruction by the time the war was over. It is said that an estimated 527,000 Filipinos, both military and civilians, had been killed from all causes. Years after the war, according to a United States analysis, U.S. casualties were 10,380 dead and 36,550 wounded. Japanese deaths were 255,795. After the war, the Philippine population decreased continuously for the next 5 years due to the spread of diseases and the lack of basic needs, far from the Filipino lifestyle prior to the war, wherein the Philippines had been the second richest in Asia after Japan. On the day of July 4, 1946, the Filipino people got their long-desired independence from the United States of America, and since then officially became the Republic of the Philippines. The Philippine Campaign is one of the huge strategic and symbolized significant, as it marked an end of the Pacific War and for the 3 bitter years of Japanese occupation in the Pearl of the Orient Seas.